I am excited to have Miranda join us. She's driven from Maryland today, but she said she has deep Virginia roots. Grew up in Alexandria, Virginia. So Miranda Spivack is a veteran reporter and editor who specializes in government accountability and secrecy. She spent 20 years as an award-winning editor and reporter for the Washington Post, a former Fulbright scholar and a distinguished visiting professor of journalism at DePaul University. Her work has appeared in Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting, the New York Times, USA Today, and the McClatchy newspapers. She's here tonight to talk about her first book. Yes, recently published, Backroom Deals in Our Backyards, How Government Secrecy Harms Our Communities and the Local Heroes Who Are Fighting Back. Let's give her a Harrisonburg Books and Brews welcome. We're always appreciative of people who travel that 81 and get here from long distances. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well, I didn't come at rush hour. So,
so first of all, congratulations on receiving the Studs and Ida Turkle Award for your book.
Thank you very much. And thanks for having me here tonight. I assume most of you know Studs Terkel really wrote about real people and real issues. And it was an award actually given by my publisher because Studs and Ida Turkel have had funded an endowment there. So that's the connection.
Right. And the fact that you write here about common people who are digging into things in their backyards.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
So, after you've been a veteran journalist and probably come across thousands of stories about this type of thing, why did you decide to write a book and why now?
Yeah. Well, the timing is a little bit fortuitous. The idea for the book actually goes back about 10 or 15 years when I was still at the Post. And I was covering Prince George's County, Maryland, which has a long history of corruption. And actually, at the time, you may remember this story, the county executive was busted for taking bribes. He's heard on a wiretap because the FBI busted him, but they didn't arrest him. And then they let the whole string play out. And he's heard on a wiretap calling his wife, who was on the county council, saying, "Get rid of the cash." And she stuffs it in her bra. You can look this story up. I mean, I couldn't believe it when we were writing it. But, she stuffs it in her bra, comes out, and there are two female FBI agents who then arrest her. But, they heard the whole thing on the wiretap. Anyway, that's a prelude to saying that this county government was very non-transparent, AKA very secretive. And I know as a journalist what my rights are and frankly what your rights are to public information. And I know how to ask for it and I know how to file a request and I know all that stuff. And I was still having a really hard time getting basic information. And that led me over time to think more about people who, unlike me, I had the firepower of the Washington Post, which actually meant something then. I don't know what it means now. And we had a great in-house lawyer, and he helped me a lot. And I ultimately got what I was looking for, which were outside contracts for public relations that the county was spending $200,000 on a woman named Judy Smith, who was actually the inspiration for a TV series called Scandal. I don't know if you remember that. Anyway, and she was doing crisis communications for them, except that they never communicated. So I was like, wow, this is crazy. Anyway, that was what I was looking for. We got it. But it led me to think a lot about people who have no investigative experience. They're not lawyers. They're not journalists. They have a problem in their community. Maybe the school buses aren't coming on time or the trash isn't getting picked up or somebody's building something without a permit or whatever. I mean, sewers, water, you name it. Those are, I think, the issues that really confront people and that are affected by state and local governments. And so I began, and this was a long journey. I did a series for Reveal called State Secrets, which is sort of the basis of the idea of the book, although the book is way more in depth than that series. And I just started looking around the country to see what it would be like if you were not a journalist, not a lawyer, and encountered a problem in your communities, and how you went about trying to expose it.
And the expectation of most, I think, folks is that you're going to ask for the information. We have a Freedom of Information Act. Right. We have all of this public information out there with Chatter and social media, that you're going to get this information.
Right. I think most people, it turns out, I would say naively believe, okay, it's the government, they're here to help me. That cliche. Not true. Often governments are doing deals. I know in a big chunk of Virginia, there have been a lot of secret deals done that have resulted in these mammoth data centers, for example, and that the communities aren't finding out about it till it's too late. And as we know, they are water suckers and electricity suckers. But, what happens really, it's kind of shocking. And it was even shocking to me how widespread this is. This is all over the country. But a lot of local governments either don't know what they should be giving out in public, or maybe they are hiding it because they're trying to cover up some mistake, or they're scared. Same with state governments. I mean, very non-transparent, and which is crazy in the digital age, because a lot of this information that I was looking for, that you might be looking for, should be posted online. And that would actually solve their complaint that there are too many public records requests. Okay, we'll put it online.
You mentioned even, and I guess that's a question too, you state that the compliance record requests granted has dropped from 63% to 42%. Yeah. And is that within the last 10 years, or would you say that's like a trend that we have going in democracy?
Yeah, I mean, that was a study that a guy at the University of Florida did based on a sample of public records requests that were gathered up by a group called Muck Rock. And they help facilitate local and state and sometimes federal public records requests for people. So they have a lot of data, and the rejection rate, or the we can't find it rate, or we're not going to give it to you rate has grown, at least according to their data. And, I think it's a reasonable sample. I mean, I can't absolutely vouch for it, but I can tell you that anecdotally, everything I've seen is that, yes, compliance is way down. I will say this about state and local governments: they're underfunded, and that's the legislature's fault and the governor's fault in any state. And that's, if they're going to pick between repairing the roof in the elementary school or hiring somebody to facilitate public records requests, they're going to repair the roof in the elementary school. So I get that, but, we ought to be taking advantage of the digital age, and they're not.
Well, I think one of the things that really brings this home to the reader in your book is that you really highlight 5 different stories of people who just real life encounters with issues and life-threatening issues that they had to go seek answers, and they just were thrown a roadblock, just complete, from people that were their neighbors, their people they had voted in. These are small communities. Can you share with us? I think that tonight, just hearing like one of these stories a little bit, because you can't, I was hoping to get into all 5, but I don't think we have enough time. But getting into one of those to share, just give us a backstory of one that really kind of hit some of the major things that you see happening across.
Okay, let me just tell you what the 5 issues were, and then I will focus on one of them. So one of them is a failing sewer system in a historic African-American community in Alabama, where the federal government and the state government have spent $30 million on a community of 2,000 people, and they still haven't fixed the sewer systems. You know what journalists say? Follow the money. Somebody's pocketing that money, but I can't tell you where because I had to turn in my manuscript before I solved that problem. Another one is poisoned drinking water in a public water system in Hoosick Falls, New York, and that's the one I'll go into in a little bit more depth. Toxins in firefighter protective gear. The gear that's supposedly protecting firefighters is actually poisoning them. Secret algorithms in the criminal justice system. And the most dangerous roads in your community, guess what? If you ask Virginia DOT to give you that list, they won't give it to you. So they're all different kinds of issues, but I'll tell you about Hoosick Falls, New York, a small community, maybe 3,000 people. It's sort of it's a commuter town for Albany, but it's also got its own industry in which they've used Teflon and made, protective sheeting for the lumberyard. They've made tents. They make all kinds of things that are, can slough off water and other things. And so Michael Hickey, his father died of a rare form of cancer after being totally healthy. And he's very obviously upset about this and worried about it. And he starts to realize that there are a lot of people in this pretty small community who have cancer. Was never officially identified as a cancer cluster by Andrew Cuomo's health department. And Michael starts to try to figure out what's wrong. And he thinks that maybe it's the drinking water, and it's a guess. So he goes to the mayor. And again, this is a pretty little town. And, the mayor's a part-time mayor. And Michael and his father actually had been on the town council at one point. So, he knows the ropes, sort of.
They touted this community as the best drinking water.
Yeah, they even had bragged in, I think it was 1999, that Hoosick Falls had the best drinking water in the state of New York or something like that. And it was like, oh my God. And also, it's a cute little town. It's got Victorian homes. Grandma Moses actually is buried there, and she used Hoosick Falls as sort of the model for a lot of her paintings. So it's, it's quite lovely in many ways. Anyway, Michael has an instinct, and he goes to the mayor and he says, look, maybe we should get the water tested because I'm concerned. And I think he'd learned enough about forever chemicals. This is more than 10 years ago. So our knowledge about PFOA and PFAS was still pretty limited, I would say then. Hadn't hit the public sort of consciousness. And the mayor says, well, we're not going to test the water. And I was like, what? Why not? So he on his own figures out how to get the water tested, and he has to do 2 tries. He sends it to a lab in British Columbia, which apparently was very good at testing water. And in the second try, when he had sent the water at the right temperature and it maintained the right temperature, the water comes back and it's laden with forever chemicals, way beyond even what was then a very high acceptable level that EPA allowed, but it was still way off the charts. So he goes back to the mayor again, this time with the town doctor. And the mayor, by the way, has prostate cancer, and the town doctor has another weird form of cancer. And so, Michael's thinking, come on, there's something going on here. And this time the mayor says, he goes in with his data and his test results, and the mayor says, don't tell anybody. I'm like, really? So, the story goes on and on and on from there. And finally, and this was during the Obama administration, the local EPA, the regional EPA person, a woman named Judith Enck, who actually teaches at Bennington College in nearby Vermont now, she finally, having gotten enough information together, tells Andrew Cuomo, you gotta tell the people not to drink the water in Hoosick Falls. And it turned out that the Cuomo Health Department and the Environment Department had similar data already for 18 months, and they didn't tell anybody. So, I will tell you this secrecy thing. People always ask me, are the Democrats worse than the Republicans? No, they're all bad at this. Doesn't matter who's in power. So, that story, this guy, Michael, was just like everybody else in the book, very tenacious, completely untrained. I mean, he's a college graduate. He's an insurance underwriter, but, he didn't know how to do this investigation. But he eventually, I mean, they've gotten a big settlement actually out of DuPont and some other big polluters up there.
And I think it was surprising, but why the EPA or this hadn't been regulated? Why had this not been?
Well, that's a good point. So Hoosick Falls, who knows what's going to happen now because EPA is walking out the door right now. But there's a rule for water to be tested for this stuff, but the population has to be over a certain amount. And I can't remember what it is. I think it's 10,000 residents. So Hoosick Falls was under that. So they were never required by the federal government to test the water. How big is Harrisonburg?
It's big.
Okay, get your water tested.
But there's a lot of places that surround little communities that are not 10,000.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that it struck me.
I mean, this guy's life was upended. Half the neighborhood hated him because they thought the big polluters were going to leave town with jobs. The other half of the community said, you should have told us sooner. Mm-hmm. His marriage broke up. I mean, he's in better shape now, but it's very tough to do this kind of activism. And also people don't sign up for this.
You call it an accidental activist. Yeah. And I guess, how is it that they kept, how did this person who was losing, respect of his community, divorce, that's a lot. None of it is light work, and it's usually not fast, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that what I found, everybody in the book, I think what happens is they go to the government, they think they're going to get help, they get rebuffed, and they get really mad. And that plus learning to build a network, learning to lobby, learning to show up with 50 angry people at a city council meeting as opposed to 2 or 3. The whole thing is sort of carries them along. But I really think that they just cannot believe the system isn't working for them. And that is a big part of why they're very tenacious. And it's very painful. It can be very tough to do this. But I think those are sort of the characteristics that drive these people.
Why was that secret being kept? I guess that's another question. What is being achieved by not?
Well, in Hoosick Falls, you could probably say this anywhere, but the mayor, who everybody thought was a nice guy, whatever, maybe a little ill-informed, but he had this program called Hoosick Rising, and they were trying to position Hoosick Falls as this great little place to live. And but there's going to be a problem, which is if your water's polluted, maybe it isn't so great.
That's sort of the question of how we balance in small communities, in economic development circles, when we're recruiting, businesses, we're recruiting folks to come into our communities. We're trying to create jobs. How do we also ensure that how do we balance that, that we're healthy and informed?
Right. Well, I think you got to really think about the basics, and government needs to think about the basics. You want to have clean drinking water. You want to have a functioning sewer system. You want to have decent schools. I think those are the draws, frankly, for people. And then the rest will come. If you make it a great, clean, livable, safe place, that's what attracts people, and that's what attracts businesses. A lot of big corporations will say, well, we can't go to that community because the schools are crummy. It's not really, I don't think it's a complicated formula, but I think that, the other problem with local government in particular, maybe less so as state, is, these people are amateurs, and sometimes these are part-time jobs, and they're actually thinking they're doing a good civic duty, and they are. And so you want to help them. You don't want to fight with them as much as you can avoid that.
What were, some of the ways throughout the book that these activists, these engaged regular folks, actually changed that secrecy wall? How did they break it down? What were ways that tools and ways that they were able to break it down?
Yeah, well, the other thing that's going on, although this was probably less so in Hoosick Falls, because the Albany Times-Union is still a pretty good newspaper, and they did cover some of this. But in a lot of these communities, they are news deserts. And so, it used to be, and I was a local reporter in Portland, Maine, and Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and, small communities. It used to be, the local newspaper public shaming is like a very effective tool, right? Exposing these problems would be done by the local newspaper, maybe by the local radio station. That's gone. Yeah. No, you guys, you're in a pretty robust news ecosystem compared to a lot of parts of the country. But that's gone. And so what happens is people have to really they have to identify the problems, maybe ahead of really having a problem. They need to become fluent in what your rights are. Every state, and Virginia is a leader in this in many ways, every state has a good open records law and a good open meetings law. But the question is in the enforcement. And so, you should go to city council meetings because, frankly, having people in the audience, not on Zoom, in the audience, they'll eyeball you and they'll think, maybe I'm not going to do that thing I was thinking about. And certainly having reporters in the room always helped. I used to have to hang out at these meetings till midnight because, of course, that's when they were doing everything they didn't want the public to see. But now you guys need to do it. And building networks. There's a group in Chicago that's expanding around the country called Documenters, which is training people to go to public meetings, be able to write about what happened, for the community, and just trying to share information in every way possible. Community listservs are effective on that. Amazingly enough, if there's anybody under 50 in the room, Facebook, it was used by pretty much everybody I wrote about as a communications tool. And it is used a lot for community organizing around the country. I tell this to university students and they're looking at me like, what, Facebook? We're not on Facebook. Well, they should be. And young journalists should be monitoring it.
I see everyone signing up to go to that midnight meeting, right? Let's talk on the larger scale. I know we can go back but your book goes into that as well, as far as, trends nationally. Yeah. How does outsourcing, how has that affected our access to public records?
Yeah. So I would say, at least going back to Reagan, maybe even earlier, governments, claiming they were going to save money, started outsourcing a lot of functions. And what that does, however, to public information is sometimes it will leave the data and the documents in the hands of the outside contractor instead of in the government. And if you've ever filed a public records request for something that was contracted out, sometimes you'll get the answer from the government, which is, we don't have it, because we haven't extracted it from our contractor. They should, but they haven't. And sometimes they leave it alone because the contractor says, if we give out this information, it's going to be a trade secret and it's going to hurt our position in the marketplace. And so, we're going to turn down the public records request. I will tell you this, that Arlington, when they finally won that great prize, which was Amazon's second headquarters, and I say that facetiously in case you hadn't picked up on that, Amazon asked for advance notice of any public records request about Amazon and its second headquarters and all the freebies that Arlington and the state of Virginia were giving to Jeff Bezos, a bazillionaire. And Arlington said, sure, we'll give you advance notice. And of course, what that does is let Amazon come up with a defense for not giving out the information. And, if somebody filed a public records request asking for my FOIAs, for example, for my public records request, which you could do if you want to know what I'm looking for, nobody's given me advance notice. I could tell you that. It's just unbelievable, but believable. So,
but most of those happen behind closed doors. They're not publicly debated?
Yeah, often they're not publicly debated. A lot of these data center deals, the giveaways are done behind closed doors because it's a real estate deal, is what the government will say. And real estate is one of the exemptions to public records and public meetings. So not forever, but in the early stages, real estate deals can be kind of massaged behind closed doors. So that is a big problem. And, I think you need to agitate in Richmond about trying to narrow what constitutes a real estate deal and at what point it could be made public. It certainly, in my view, ought to be made public before all the giveaways are given away.
Well, or at least know what those giveaways are.
Right.
And who owns them.
Yeah, I think the key is to get in on the discussion, though, before the deal is done, because once the deal's done, the public's out of it. Yeah. All right. So can you tell me what's happening here? Because I don't know. They're here taking people off the streets.
Question is what we can do to open up the criminal, the folks pulling people on the street.
So is the local police force, Virginia's cooperating, right? Pretty much. Because actually I would go there first. That's interesting. Okay. And you have a city police force, right? I would go to them for starters and ask them what kind of communications they have had with ICE. Give them a time period, because when you ask a question like I just asked, they'll look at you and they'll say, whoa, that's way too broad. We can't do it. It's going to cost you $1,000 and, whatever. But if the city police have, for whatever reasons, they haven't signed on, they should know what the whole deal is and what the agreements are. And if the county, I can't believe they would be cut out of the communications chain. So I would start with them. I would certainly ask the county police for, what agreements, what have they agreed to? And, you should file a federal Freedom of Information Act request, if only to clog up the works because they're not responding. But, some journalist someday is going to say they had 50,000 requests and they didn't answer them, which is illegal, actually. So, there may be what goes around may come around. I don't know. But and then, of course, if you have community networking, if people are documenting this, photos are pretty powerful.
You actually have a tool book or a tool set in the back of the book. The
last chapter
gives you addresses and sources.
Yes. Well, I think it's got to be both. Although if it's an environmental issue, the state government, what is it, DEQ here, you should go to them immediately. And, you ought to keep an eye on who's Spanberger going to put in charge of that. And how, and what are the reporting requirements for these big corporations? At this point, it used to be they had to do a lot of stuff under the Clean Water Act to report to EPA. And the state may still be reporting to EPA, which you could also ask for, as opposed to asking EPA, which is hopeless at this point, I think. But I agree with you. I think the problem is smaller governments, part-time officials, they're amateurs, they're scared. They don't, God forbid you're the elected official who runs jobs out of town. I get that. So, but the state government ought to be monitoring any kind of pollution.
Is there support with the small governments?
Right. So there should be. The Attorney General's office actually should be helping them understand what their obligations are, how to keep their records, et cetera. I don't know. In Maryland, where I live, they actually do a lot of training for smaller governments. They may well do it here in Virginia. I don't know. But, they're also like the National League of Cities and U.S. Conference of Mayors. They may be able to help too. But, I think the key with smaller governments is not to go in and be angry and hostile, but to go in and say, how can I be helpful? This is a community issue, even though the mayor in Hoosick Falls said, go away. He was scared. I get that.
That question of regulators too kind of comes up in the story of the folks who are making the items that are making people sick are actually on the regulation board.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's true. In the case of the firefighters, this is really interesting and troubling. So firefighter protective gear is actually like wearing Teflon. And, there are good reasons for that. Firefighting is very dangerous. You don't want to get burned with hot water. You don't want to be burned with chemicals. I mean, there's all kinds of junk if this place were, God forbid, to be set on fire, who knows what those chairs are made of, but nothing good, probably. So there is a regulatory board, sort of. It's not a government board. It's called the National Fire Protection Association. It's in Quincy, Massachusetts. They set all the safety standards for hoses, for trucks, for helmets, the whole bit. And it's sort of a consortium of firefighters, industry, some government people, whatever. And it's like Underwriters Laboratory. I mean, that's a private entity too, but they make a lot of recommendations that the government routinely accepts for electrical safety. So it's that kind of thing. And the problem there was that at least Diane Cotter, who is the person who discovered the problems with firefighter turnout gear, the problem there was that the industry experts were sort of running the show, and the organization had no conflict of interest rules, so they could vote on stuff that they had, a direct interest in. Nothing's changed, even though I wrote about it.
How about our criminal system, our court system, and how you speak to that? You say that, the Supreme Court has pretty much been a big instrument in dismantling transparency.
Yeah. I mean, actually, it started a long time ago. I think it was 2013. There's a case out of Virginia called McBurney versus, I can't remember, I guess who was ever the attorney general at the time. And the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and others were on the court at this time, they unanimously ruled that Virginia was okay in its law that said nobody other than citizens, not even residents, citizens of Virginia could file public records requests and have them responded to. And this came about because somebody in Rhode Island wanted information from Virginia and couldn't get it. And unfortunately, 15 states, mostly in the South actually, have a similar law. So they won't give out public records to anybody who's not a citizen of that state. I encountered that in research I did for the book in Alabama. And the Supreme Court said that was 2013. They said that was okay. And then they had a succession of other rulings that made it much easier for corporate secrets, even when the corporation was doing government work, for the corporations to claim that everything was proprietary and a trade secret. And they would let the corporation label it, and then the government itself couldn't challenge it. And that's the state of play on trade secrets, which is, according to a couple of judges that I've talked to and written about, it's one of the most abused exemptions to public records. Everything's a trade secret. So, and the governments actually aren't equipped to challenge that either. I mean, some chemical company, I couldn't, if I were, this government county council member or whatever, I couldn't tell you that it wasn't a trade secret. So it leaves a lot of power in the hands of these corporations.
Question is on specifically the electrical co-ops in our community, that they have meetings and they treat their co-op as customers. They're not open meetings. How do you penetrate to get to the information from those meetings? They're making energy decisions for everybody, right, and members can't get that information.
So who's on their board? Is that members, owners? They're elected. Huh. So somebody must have gone to the legislature years ago and gotten an exemption for this, right? I mean, that's all I can think, because on its face, it's electric utility is doing the public's business. And so, by my definition, it should be subject to open meetings laws, but there must be an exemption written into Virginia law. So you're probably going to have to figure that out and then get somebody in the legislature to unravel it. I mean, what's the benefit to them to not having the public there. So the functioning of the electric cooperative is not public. Okay. I mean, I'm just surmising without knowing the specifics that Virginia has some lobby, probably in the time of maybe the New Deal, which is when the electric co-ops go back to. But somebody's gotten them an exemption. So you got to find somebody in the legislature who thinks that's wrong and is willing to carry the water. But I think you got to read the law first to be sure to understand how it is that they're doing it. Is it possible that they're just breaking the open meetings law?
In the book, you also had where neighbors talk to each other. You build bigger coalitions. I mean, is that a possibility? You get more people asking those questions.
I mean, how many electric co-ops are there in Virginia? There are probably several. They're probably people who feel just like you do, which is...
Share a story where your reporting has impacted the policy issue. Something uplifting for fun.
Oh my God.
We want to hear something fun. Some change.
Yeah. Okay. Well, boy. So back to Prince George's County, Maryland, where they had done so much illegal stuff that the government was being successfully sued by people who'd been wronged. And then they were these settlements from the police department, from the county executive, et cetera, were secret settlements because they would go to court and they would get an out-of-court settlement and they'd talk a judge into putting it under seal. And thousands, if not millions of dollars were being spent of public money, and the public wasn't in on it at all. So I did write about that. And although it's still allowed under Maryland law, it has highly discouraged governments from not revealing how much they're paying out in out-of-court settlements. It's often police cases, but they're much more open now than they maybe were 10 years ago. That's about all I can tell you. I will tell you this, though, after I wrote the book and before I wrote the last chapter, which is the how-to chapter with a lot of advice, I sort of felt like you did, which was, God, this is really depressing, This is not a good way to, it's a reflection of reality, but, what was I going to do? And that sort of spurred me to write the how-to chapter, which is, okay, you guys have the power. You do, actually, not just at the voting booth, but also in everyday life. And if you get together, here are the tools, and you can affect change in your community. And numbers really matter to politicians. Showing up with 3 people is not nearly as effective as a petition with 100 names on it of people who are willing to make a fuss.
That definitely left us in a positive space of what we can do. And it seems like if there was more engaged citizens, if we were, take our time going to meetings.
Well, I think now, as somebody who grew up in the Washington area, amidst thousands of public employees, and my father was a journalist, and, it's just a whole different scene now, obviously. And it just makes me think more and more that people really need to get engaged at the local level, and that change that you start making locally can ripple up. And depending on where you are politically, I think you have to look at last week's elections and say, people did vote for change and their voices were heard. And it can't just be at the ballot box, is what I'm saying. You really got to show up at meetings and monitor issues.
Well, thank you very much for being here tonight, for sharing your book. Your book is available here, and she'll be available to answer more questions, more specific questions, to get into that, the toolkit of how we can become a bit more engaged as citizens. Yeah. All right, let's give her a hand for coming here tonight.